Good morning. My name is Mark Barnico, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Francis and Rose Yuen campus in Hong Kong. Thank you for joining our program on COVID's impact on families with young children. We're sharing this morning's event live via Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube from the UChicago Yuen campus in Hong Kong. If audience members have questions to submit, you can do so through the question and answer button by first registering on Zoom. I also encourage you to visit the Yuen campus website at www.uchicago.hk and subscribe to our e-news for the latest Yuen campus programs and information. Or you can also follow the UChicago Yuen campus Hong Kong social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and our new channel on LinkedIn. We'll wrap up today's program with a poll and more information about upcoming events, so please be sure to stay until the very end. The COVID-19 crisis and its reverberations resulted in levels of economic stress unprecedented since the 1930s. The pandemic has represented a time of increased economic uncertainty and stress, perhaps especially for low-income parents. The long-term impact of the COVID-19 crisis will not affect all families equally, but may cause particular harm to children of low-income and less educated parents, and for preschool-age children who are especially sensitive to developmental inputs. Our guest this morning is Professor Ariel Kalil, Daniel Levin Professor of the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. Professor Kalil is a developmental psychologist who studies economic conditions, parenting, and child development. She directs the Center for Human Potential and Public Policy and co-directs the Behavioral Insights and Parenting Lab. Professor Kalil's research examines the historical evolution of income-based gaps in parenting behavior and children's cognitive and non-cognitive skills. She also leads a variety of field experiments designed to strengthen parental engagement and child development in low-income families using tools drawn from behavioral economics and neuroscience. This morning, Professor Kalil will share her recent research on financial scarcity, stress, and inattention in low-income parents of young children under the COVID crisis. Welcome, Professor Kalil. Let's get started this morning by having you share your research findings with the audience, and I'll come back and facilitate the audience questions later.
Very good. Thank you so much for your kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you, albeit virtually. And thank you so much to all the participants who are here. You did a fabulous job teeing up my topic and the theme of our research. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides and I will get started. And as I told Mark, I'm planning to talk for just around 40 minutes, and then I'm really looking forward to your questions. So this is work that I conducted with several colleagues, my faculty colleague, Susan Mayer, who is the co-director along with me of the Behavioral Insights and Parenting Lab at the Harris School, and one of our PhD students, Rowan Shaw. And the topic of our paper, as you can see here, is focusing on financial scarcity, which let me just define up front, and I'll redefine it in a moment, but just to get you in the frame of mind of what I'm talking about. Our faculty colleague at the Booth School, Sendel Mullainathan, and his co-author, Eldar Shafir, wrote an extremely well-known book, I think it was published in 2013, called Scarcity. And the general thesis that they promulgated in that very important book is that a sense of not having what you need when you need it is cognitively distracting and shapes decision-making. And importantly, in their book, this idea of scarcity can apply not only to financial scarcity, that is not having sufficient money to make ends meet, but also to a scarcity of emotional bonds, which we think of as loneliness, or if you are a dieter, a scarcity of calories. In other words, we're focusing in this particular paper on financial scarcity, but the theme is much bigger than that. And so I want to set that out there as an important place to start. And then in a moment, as I will tell you, we are looking at how low-income families in the city of Chicago were experiencing this sense of not being able to make ends meet and the psychological stress that goes along with that. During the height of the COVID pandemic, we conducted this survey immediately after schools closed down, and indeed after the entire city of Chicago closed down in the spring of 2020. So with that very broad introduction, let me just get to some more details. So as I mentioned, really drawing a lot of inspiration from Mullainathan and Shafir, this idea that a psychological sense of having less than you feel you need is cognitively compromising, that the mental distractions that arise from having to focus overly much on the very thing that you feel you lack leads you to ignore other things in your environment, attention, people, opportunities, and so forth. And this so-called scarcity theory, as I said, this psychological sense of having less than you feel you need, whether that is money, time, friendship, food, it imagines that people who are struggling with that psychological sensation are making the decisions that they must still make with this so-called scarcity mindset. Now, importantly, Mullainathan and Shafir argue, in fact, that this is evolutionarily adaptive, right? When we are operating under conditions of constraints, we have less than we feel we need. What we need to do is focus the most on the very element that is scarce in our environment so that we can solve that problem of scarcity. As you can see, that's adaptive in the sense that we need to focus all of our limited resources on solving that problem. But as you might also imagine, the maladaptive consequences of that so-called scarcity mindset begin to arise when we begin to deplete our attention from other important things in our lives, or when we fail to make decisions or fail to attend to all the other things that are happening. Typically, people have a lot of things going on in their life at any given point, and they have to allocate some attention to multiple ones at the same time. But this scarcity mindset drives our attention, it tunnels our attention to the one thing that is scarce at the expense of other things that demand our attention. In the book, which is called Scarcity, if I didn't say that, Mullainathan and Shafir refer to this as the bandwidth tax. That is, the cognitive tax on that tunneling is this sort of constricted bandwidth, that is, that the lesser amount of cognitive capacity left over for all other decisions. And it is this bandwidth tax, in fact, that ironically perpetuates scarcity to the extent that it induces suboptimal or short-sighted decisions. So this is all, it can be evolutionarily adaptive, but it becomes a vicious cycle, this so-called scarcity trap. So again, this is a pretty big field of research in behavioral science, work at the intersection of behavioral economics and social psychology. And it is this body of research in which we are placing the work that we did. So our research question for this particular paper asks, to what extent is a scarcity mindset, which we think we have captured in our data, to what extent is that scarcity mindset associated with parents' inattention to information that was provided to them during the COVID pandemic by their child's preschool? You might say, well, why is any of that relevant or important? So as I'll tell you in a moment, this is a sample of low-income parents of preschool-age children whose kids were all enrolled in preschool. In fact, these were parents, several hundred of them, who had been participating with us in an ongoing study of young children's cognition and development. And for these families, the preschool is an important institution in their life. Okay, it's a place their kids go every day. It's a place where they get a lot of information about child development. It's actually a place where they have a lot of social connections and social capital. So in Chicago, in the US, as in many places, on March 20th or so, the preschools closed down without warning. They were shut down and there were stay-at-home orders imposed on people here, and kids couldn't go to school anymore. So the preschools, in fact, we would argue, became even more important as an institution in that family's life because they went to huge lengths to try to support parents, these low-income parents who were now responsible for homeschooling their kids. And so the preschools sent lots of information home to families about supports they could access in the community to meet their material needs, but also to support their new role as their child's only teacher and so forth. So this is, again, I would just argue to you, a highly salient phenomenon to be studying during this time. And we're going to have what we think is a rather unique way of measuring, did that information reach the parents at all? And a secondary question we're going to ask is, to the extent that this scarcity mindset is related to parents' inattention to this critical information, what's the mechanism there? And here we're going to look at parents' reports of stress. The literature, again, suggests that the reason that this scarcity mindset depletes attention on other things in the environment may be because of the stress that the parent is feeling in life. Okay, so let me just describe what the data are to you, having laid out a little bit of the framework and what we're doing. So as I said, we have rich survey data from about 350 parents. These are low-income parents of preschool-age children. And we did, as I said, these families were all in an ongoing study that we were doing that well predates COVID and the lockdowns and school closures. And when COVID hit, we realized that we really needed to understand what was happening with these families, and that it was a unique opportunity to invite them to be in a quickly planned new survey. And we had generous support from the Becker-Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago to do this work. And one of the things we asked about, as I alluded to, we asked parents, how were they coping during this period of school closures? Where were they getting information from? And we asked some, specific questions from the parents. Which of the following on a list of types of information did your preschool center send to you? So what's unique about our data is that we also had the cooperation of the directors of the preschools that the children were attending. And so we were able to ask those preschool directors the very same question. What information did you send home to the parents who are attending this school? Because we were interested in how preschools, some of the preschools actually got some extra stimulus funds to help them support the families that were engaged in their school. And we were very interested in what preschools were doing as institutions. So the unique feature of these data is that we have the information, we asked the parents, what did you get? And we ask the center directors, what did you send? And we call, we will define inattention as an instance where the preschool director said information was sent and the parents did not tell us that that was information that they got. As I'll describe in a minute, we're going to take the preschool center director's word as the gold standard. We're going to just prioritize believing that they know what they did send. And so this mismatch in what we know was sent and what parents said was received is going to be our measure of inattention. Again, during a period of time in Chicago, in the US, around the world, that was a huge period of economic and social disruption, when we think that this kind of scarcity mindset and inattention may be likely to be highly salient. Okay, just a preview of the results. This is University of Chicago style, where usually the speaker has been interrupted many times by now. And so, which is fine to not be interrupted, but we are in the habit of telling you the results in case we don't get to the end of our presentation. Anyway, what I will just say is that along with many other works in this area, we too find that parents' financial scarcity mindset is significantly positively associated with inattention to information that was sent home about those important resources to help them deal with their family life during the COVID-19 pandemic. We find, somewhat contra to our prediction, however, that financial scarcity, this subjective sense of not having enough money to make ends meet, and life stress are largely independent phenomena, and they have similar impacts on inattention. So we don't find that stress plays any mediating or explanatory role, but rather that it is equally important as a predictor of inattention. And it is the magnitude of this of these correlations is such that parents who report both a financial scarcity mindset and above average levels of life stress are 50% more likely than their counterparts who experience neither one of those psychological phenomena to be inattentive to the information that the preschools said they had sent. So now I think I can probably go over some of these slides fairly quickly because I've told you a lot in the warm up about what we've done, but just to remind you, and this is a survey we did with 345 low-income families. We jumped right into the field shortly after the COVID pandemic yielded the lockdowns and school closures. We quickly put our survey together and got our permissions to do the work in the end of March and April, and by May we were in the field. And so over these 2 months, 3 months really, from May to July, we did survey 345 of these families who were attending 11 different preschools in the city of Chicago. And as I said, we also interviewed the 11 directors of those centers. We mostly interviewed the surveys by phone, as it turns out. Some of the families took the survey online, but mostly we had a small army of research assistants who spent many, many, many hours on the phone calling parents to get them to complete the survey, which had a very high response rate. As I said, this just tells you more details about the response rate. We had almost an 80% response rate to this survey, which I take as indicative that families really wanted to talk to us and tell us about their experiences during COVID, that they might have been socially isolated and needed someone to talk to. But for a survey that hadn't been planned, that we hadn't already told parents to anticipate, that we just cold called them and asked them to participate, we were quite pleased with this, as I said, 78% response rate to the survey. Just to give you some demographic characteristics, again, I told you these are low-income families. The children all attend subsidized preschools, which in Chicago and in the US, you might know as the Head Start program. In Chicago, we also have subsidized preschools paid for by the state called Pre-K for All. These are low-income families. Generally, the respondent In our surveys, when we ask who's the primary caregiver, is the mother. So 92% of these parents are the mothers of the child. These mothers are relatively young. They're on average 32. Some of them have had some college experience, but very few have a BA degree. And you can see the race and ethnic composition here at the bottom. Approximately a third of the sample is Black, is white, or is Hispanic. And then you can see the median family income is by definition quite low at $20,000 per year. So these demographic characteristics are quite similar to those that we know to be the general population of families whose children attend these kinds of programs. Okay, so again, I'm going to just share with you how we coded some of these data. Low-income parents' inattention to information as a consequence of their financial scarcity, which I'm going to tell you is a subjective measure that we ask parents about how well do they think they have enough money to make ends meet. I told you how we measured inattention, which again is just a mismatch between what preschool directors said they sent and what parents said they received. And life stress is just going to be one measure, asking parents to rate the level of stress they're feeling in their lives at this moment. So here you can just see, I'm not going to read each of these things out to you, but this slide just shows you the kinds of information that was sent home by the preschools. I'll show you in a minute. There's some variation across the preschools in whether they sent all of these kinds of information, but this is what we asked about. So our survey asked both the preschool directors and the parents about information related to preventing the spread of COVID, finding help with food and meals, accessing the internet, online learning for their children, managing stress, accessing social services, and finding childcare. All, we think, highly salient challenges that low-income families would need help with during this period of lockdown and school closures. So those are the categories of information. And just to tell you in a little bit more detail, what is the measure of financial scarcity? This is the question we ask them. Think about last month and which one of these statements best describes how much money you will have left over at the end of the month. Some money left over, just enough money to make ends meet, or not enough money to make ends meet. And so we call responses that say not enough money to make ends meet, we define that as having a scarcity mindset. We call having some money left over, we call that a sufficient mindset on attention, recognizing that might not be sufficient for everything the family might need, but it's families tell us that at the end of the month they have some money left over. We believe them. And so these are just going to be the two dummy variables in a regression, with the omitted group is going to be just enough money to make ends meet. So here's the distribution of this key variable in our sample of 345 low-income families. And so you can see it's not the case that even among these very low-income families, many of whom have also lost their job as a consequence of the shutdown of many establishments, about a quarter of them tell us that they have not enough money to make ends meet. Half of them say they have just enough money to meet, and fully another quarter of them say they have some money left over. So I think, first of all, this illustrates a broader important point about this measure that is a subjective measure of your felt experience. It is not the same as poverty. It is not the same as low income. As you can see, there's a quite wide range of variation in a low income sample in who has this perception. It's also the case that not poor families, people can feel this sense of financial scarcity. One doesn't have to be officially below the poverty line to feel as if you don't have enough money to make ends meet. Now, we're not talking this, the idea, the theory here is sort of not that you don't have enough money to take all the extravagant vacations that you might want, but whether you don't have enough money for the really basic needs that are necessary for living. But again, I really want to make the point home that this is not entirely overlapping or even mostly overlapping with families' actual income level. Okay, and then as I said, the other key measure we have is just a simple one-item question. How stressful do you find your life these days? And again, you might be surprised just looking at this descriptive statistic. I think people have the impression that low-income families are highly stressed all the time. Our data don't show that. You answer this question from a range of, you choose 0 to 10, where 0 means my life is not at all stressful and 10 means my life is extremely stressful at this moment. And the average we get is 4.27. So there's a wide range of subjective perceptions. The answers are not all clustered at the extreme at 10 or anything like that. And again, although this is a sample of low-income families, my guess is that if we had a sample of high-income families, the number might look quite similar to this, with a distribution, but an average that doesn't fall at either one of the extremes. Okay, we just have a few controls that I'm not going to actually spend a lot of time on. We have a pretty small sample here of 345, so I can't give away too many degrees of freedom to a whole lot of control variables, but we're controlling for whether or not the family has internet access, whether families have some college experience, and family size here, just because we think that these 3 covariates might be predictive both of financial scarcity and of parents' ability to get or attend to the information that was presented to them. So a modest set of controls in these regressions. What I'm showing you here is, so there's 2 things going on. The top half of this table shows us where it says given info. This is the proportion of parents who attended a school where the administrator claimed to have sent this particular kind of information home. And again, we're going to believe the preschool administrator when he or she says that was done. And so across those 11 schools, you can just see that most of this information was sent out by most of the schools. So 100% of the schools sent information to the families on how to access meals. 95% sent information home about online learning, accessing the internet, and preventing the spread of COVID. Slightly fewer sent information on stress management and childcare, but still very large shares nonetheless did. Okay, the bottom half of the panel is showing us what is the share of parents who said that they did not get that information that the preschool said was sent. So the inattention rate is very low for meals, online learning, preventing the spread of COVID, for example. So only 7% of parents said, I didn't get information about meals when the preschool director said it was sent, and so forth. So that would be a very high match rate. Director said it was sent. Me, I'm the parent. I said I got it. That is true for several of these measures, but parents also failed to attend in fairly large numbers to information that the preschool said they sent home about stress management and childcare, which is sort of interesting because those are arguably also types of information that we think parents might need the most during this time. So there's less variation in what preschool directors said they sent than there is variation in what parents said they got. And that is our mismatch or inattention variable. Here, I'm just going to show you this, looking at it one more way. Here, as I told you, we had up to 7 different types of inattention, seven different types of information that parents could have gotten. And this just shows you the number of parents, or the percent of parents who were inattentive to information in the kind of linear or continuous form. So, only 43% of parents missed nothing. That's the kind of easiest way to. So more than half of parents in this sample missed at least one type of information that the preschool center directors said were sent. It's not a huge rate. 21% only missed one type of information, 13% missed two, now 12% missed three types of information, and 11%, which is small, but I would argue still important, missed most of the information that was sent. So again, this is just giving you the distribution of inattention to information in that kind of categorical way here. Okay, so here's the main results. So this is basically the bottom line. You can see here, we just have three models in this extremely simple regression. Model 1 just enters those two scarcity mindset dummy variables, where again, the omitted or comparison group here is having just enough to make ends meet. And you can see that having a scarcity mindset, or feeling that you don't have enough money to make ends meet, is significantly and importantly associated with inattention. This model here is just showing us inattention as a dummy variable outcome. That is, were you inattentive at all to any type of information? But this is not symmetrical. So interestingly, having this sort of sufficient mindset, which is I have some money left over, does not significantly reduce inattention. You might think that those would be operating in the opposite, like equally offsetting ways. It doesn't. The coefficient is negative, but having a scarcity mindset is far more important in the negative sense than is having a sufficient mindset in a positive sense. So that's model 1. Model 2 just adds in those controls, and you can see that the coefficients are quite similar between model 1 and model 2 on those scarcity measures. Model 3 adds the measure of stress, which you can see is on its own highly significant and doesn't much move the coefficient on the scarcity mindset. So there's not a lot of evidence here that it is explaining the scarcity mindset. And as I said at the beginning, in fact, it is just as important on its own. So those really are the main results. And we do some robustness checks to look at the outcome variable in some different specifications. We look at it in terms of this linear function, this inattention rate, and we find that it's the association is a little bit weaker, but scarcity mindset is still significant. It's no longer significant. Just things get a bit noisy when we look at different kind of distributional effects, but we're pretty sure that having this scarcity mindset in terms of financial scarcity is an important correlate of inattention. And as I said, I mentioned this at the beginning, but here's what that looks like when we just do some predictions of the inattention for parents who are experiencing these different combination of financial scarcity mindset or life stress. And this figure just shows you that parents with both the financial scarcity mindset and above average levels of life stress are, 77% of them are inattentive to at least some information, which is 50% higher than those parents with neither a subjective sense of financial scarcity nor a subjective sense of high life stress. Okay, but I think this figure also shows that inattention to information is nonetheless an important problem, because fully 48% of this sample misses at least some information. They are inattentive to at least some extent, even when they are experiencing neither financial scarcity nor high levels of stress. That's the first bar. So, nearly half of that sample is not getting the information, which is a sort of, I think, an equally important point that we find here, that there's a lot going on in families' lives that is making them miss this important information, maybe how it's sent, the modality with which it's sent, how many times it was sent. But parents, again, who are experiencing these psychological subjective experiences are substantially more likely to fall into that category. Okay, so I don't really need to say the main results again. I feel like I've said them several times, but let me just go to our conclusion. So, our work here has some strengths and some weaknesses. In the broader scarcity literature that Mullainathan and Shafir have been so instrumental in developing, these are mostly lab experimental work where a sense of scarcity, whether that's time, money, calories, thirst, whatever, is experimentally induced. And so subjects come into the research lab and their sense of scarcity is experimentally manipulated. And then subjects take some kind of test. It might be a test of cognition. It might be a sort of a puzzle task of various short tasks which measure their cognitive focus and their attention and so forth. So this is, these lab studies are super important because everything is controlled, everything is manipulated. On the other hand, we think it's possibly a sort of a false or unrealistic environment. So subjects know they're in a research study, they're induced to feel a certain way, and then they take a test, and we're just going to argue that the external validity of those associations needs to be established. We feel we've done that in our work, and we really like our measure of inattention. We feel that the strength of having this kind of objective measure where it's not all parents self-report is a strength. On the other hand, parents' reports of their subjective experiences are just that. They're just subjective. We have no way of knowing if there's some underlying truth that we're not observing. And we can never be sure that the parents' report of this subjective sense is not simply reflective of some other third variable that we are not adequately capturing in our survey. So there's some trade-offs here between the kind of internal and external validity. As I said before, there's a lot of other drivers of inattention beyond these subjective psychological characteristics. At least half the sample is inattentive to some of this information, which I think should stop a lot of programs in their tracks because most programs in the world that are trying to get people to change their behavior or make a choice or do something are relying on information to be effective. Now, again, in the behavioral science world, we generally don't think that information is sufficient. Information alone doesn't do very much to get people to change their behavior, but obviously it's a necessary, typically first instance, first condition. So as long as information remains a primary vehicle for inducing behavior change, I think we need to really take seriously the fact that many people are not paying attention and that these subjective psychological states really exacerbate that problem. And so that just leads us to ask us, well, how do we solve that problem? What are the policy implications of that problem? There's a lot of work on, as I said at the beginning, just making communication more salient. So if you want people to pay attention to information that you're giving them, there's lots of ways you can do that. You can reformat the form that you send them. You can send it on colorful paper. You can send it via email or text or via a letter or some other mode. You can call people and you can figure out for yourself which of those is more effective. You can send reminders, all sorts of ways to make information more salient. And there's actually a huge area of research on that. If we think, however, that these subjective psychological states are important, it becomes a little bit harder to imagine how we're going to solve those problems. So how do we make people feel like they have enough to make ends meet? Maybe that doesn't sound like the approach we want to take. My job is not to convince you that you do have enough to make ends meet when you don't feel that you do. But maybe I could imagine that if stress is an important predictor of cognitive distraction and inattention, I can think of inexpensive or scalable ways to reduce your stress. In our research lab, we have a project on mindfulness and stress reduction and trying to imagine if you can help parents. We've been working with low-income parents, as you now know, if we can help them kind of expand cognitive bandwidth in the moment where they need to make an important decision. Does that help expand cognitive focus and lead them to a choice that's better for their family or more in line with their original intentions? So that's a possible policy implication that comes out of this. But I think the bottom line is really, again, just if we're thinking about institutions and how people and institutions interact, how people consume information, which is such a part of everyday life, we really need to be mindful that psychological experiences, subjective psychological experiences that are common, widespread, and especially salient during periods of economic and social turbulence, may really be a barrier to interacting with families and to supporting them to make the choices that we would like them to make in the service of helping their family. So I'm going to just say thank you for that. And I think I will stop sharing my screen and hope that, oh, that's been done for me. So I would just look forward to your questions now.
Thank you, Professor Kalil, for sharing what is really representative of a U Chicago lecture about the kind of research that's being done in Chicago. I'm sure our audience has a lot of questions. We have a few coming in. I wanted to start by asking you about the broader implications for the research and the applicability, in particular, since we have predominantly an Asian audience based in Asia, whether the results you feel are transferable.
Thank you. I do feel like these results are highly transferable. I wouldn't know in particular. So again, the particular dimension of scarcity that we focused on here, this financial scarcity, is obviously relevant in a low-income sample in a period of economic turbulence. That sounds applicable beyond Chicago to me. I also think that really, as I said, this is an illustration of a much broader phenomenon. And as others have argued, scarcity need not be exclusively financial scarcity, right? That there's lots of things people think that they need, that a basic need for to thrive, for their family to thrive, for their well-being. And I'm pretty sure that in most places around the world, there is at least some dimension that's highly salient that some people don't feel that they have. So I think that showing the association between these subjective psychological states, I also think attending to information is pretty universal in the modern world, where people are bombarded with information all the time in most contexts. So I think because these are such broad constructs that this is actually some of the more universal kind of work that I've ever done. Usually I'm evaluating a policy in the US, or I'm evaluating a program that might be very specific to low-income children in the US or in Illinois or even in Chicago. And that, that might not be as globally relevant, but I think this is.
Great, thank you. We have another question, and we often get questions about the method used. And so this is probably a fairly quick answer from you, but is the method that you used a mixed method or just a quantitative method?
For this, sir, we do both in our research lab. This was just a survey, a quantitative survey. We had limited time. We had limited amounts of families' time. So we just created a quantitative survey that took about 15 to 20 minutes of families' time to answer over the phone. We felt sort of during this period, it was hard for us to ask more of parents than that for this particular survey.
Great, thank you. And we have another question that, can you explain the possible reasons why scarcity mindset and life stress is independent? And then a follow-on question, which was one of my questions. Also, is there a difference in inattention for a single parent? This one says single mother family, but I'll say single parent family.
Sure. Let me take the second question first. That's something we'd really like to know. Of the family structure. I mean, it would be great if we could look at all sorts of interactions, sort of, you know, is this scarcity mindset more powerful or more detrimental for some types of families than others? We don't have a particularly big sample, so we couldn't do all those interactions. That's actually why we controlled for family size as one of our controls, because we did think that, so first of all, let me just say, in this low income sample, we have many unmarried mothers. It doesn't mean that they're living alone. A number is living with a partner, and another, you know, quite important share is living with their own parent in a multi-generational household. But we just, you know, we think that large family sizes in this context of COVID, you know, might have been energy depleting and distracting on their own. So that's why we controlled for that. So I would just say that our results show that kind of over and above family structure or household composition, we find this relationship between financial scarcity and inattention. The first question, why are these independent, is quite interesting. And I'm not sure that I have the answer. I mean, what I'd really like to explore is, you know, what other types of financial, or not financial, but rather perceived scarcity people might also be experiencing. So for example, you know, COVID might have been a period of great social isolation for families, and they were cut off from social ties or workplaces, which is where many people have their social interactions. So the research that suggested that stress is sort of the mechanism is not very large, and so it was sort of our secondary question, just to test whether this was a kind of indirect or, you know, explanatory mechanism, and we just find that it isn't. And that there's sort of, you can be stressed for other reasons, not, you know, not just because you feel you don't have enough money to make ends meet. So that's, you know, that's something for us to look further into.
Maybe this is a good follow-on question for you, related specifically to the Hong Kong situation.
Yeah.
The audience member is talking about the high cost of living here, the tense socio-political atmosphere here in Hong Kong. Do you think that Hong Kong, if you were able to extrapolate on your 4.7 metric or gauge, would it be the same? Would you expect higher or lower results from that?
Would I expect higher levels of stress, for example, in other locations? Is that what you're asking me?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's quite interesting question, of course, without knowing. I mean, because it is such a subjective, individual sensation. I mean, I guess it's all relative. I mean, it's a little hard for me to, you know, how stressed do I feel right at this moment? Probably depends on how stressed I have felt in all my prior lifetime. If there have been times when I've been more stressed, maybe I'll say, well, right now it's not too bad, because let me tell you, I can really remember a previous time. Or maybe for some families, COVID, for many families is a huge disruption, the likes of which they've never felt before. And so typically maybe they're a 1. And today I ask you and you're a 4.7. That's a pretty big difference. But I guess because it is such an individual psychological characteristic, it would be a little hard for me to know what people's steady state is, if that makes sense. You can imagine the kind of social disruptions that would make everybody feel more stressed. And it certainly could be possible that in a place where cost of living is extreme and huge numbers of people are falling ill or dying, that does induce higher levels of stress. But there are many populations in the United States who were extremely negatively affected by COVID as well.
So the number that the 4.7, we'll just use that number,
Yeah.
is not a general gauge of a person's feeling. It's that moment in time based on
Yeah.
how much stress they're feeling in the moment.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's not like right this second, but the question is something like, how stressful do you find your life these days?
Mhm.
And then we, I mean, I guess hopefully that's not so noisy that the answer you gave about how you felt this morning is hugely different from how you felt last evening.
Right.
But it isn't like in your lifetime, how stressful do you find your life? It's we're looking at the correlation among these measures where we think this is all kind of happening simultaneously.
Great. Another question from an audience member is about, will the financial scarcity faced by parents show as low growth in the child? I'm assuming the development over the years as they grow, and then how will they be able to bridge the gap?
Yeah. So that is, again, that's like highly relevant as a policy question. I don't want to overinterpret our findings, but if you thought, for example, that the preschool was sending home information that if the parent failed to attend to it, a door might close and an opportunity might be lost. Again, if I could do this study over, I would do it in 10 different ways. It's hard for me to say, like, what will it mean for the child's development because this family wasn't able to attend to information that the preschool sent home about how to get internet or how to find a meal. I mean, I would say if families persistently were unable to attend to information about meals that they could get and they don't have enough food, that I could make a theoretical link to the child's well-being, right? So it's a little hard for me to draw a causal connection between missing information about any one of these things and the child's growth in cognitive skill or health or emotional well-being. I can't do that with my data, but I can say that as an illustration of a general phenomenon, you can easily imagine how this would spill over negatively into decisions that the parent has to make on the child's behalf. And then if you think that's true, you have two choices. You can make the information more salient, right? In a way that mitigates against the fact that a lot of people are clearly missing it, especially those who are in these psychological states, or you can solve the psychological challenge. And I don't know which one of those is easier or more or less costly. Again, as I said, it's a little hard for me to wrap my head around. I mean, if we think that people really feel they don't have enough to make ends meet because they really don't, then we can solve their problems of material hardship and hope that that makes them feel that they do have enough to make ends meet. So that's another policy lever that we could try to pull.
And just off the back of that comment that you just made, I'm wondering how much is government our government in the United States looking at the results of these kinds of research results, and then implementing policies that help support families of low income and stress.
Right. Well, I sure would love to imagine that somebody in a position of making policy was reading my paper. That would be great. I mean, I do think if you have been following at all what has been going on in the US in this policy space, you will have seen that actually the US had a pretty robust positive response to economically supporting low-income families. I mean, we had several rounds of stimulus funds. Actually, for some low-income families who lost their income from employment, the amount of temporary unemployment benefit that they got along with the stimulus fund actually exceeded the earnings that they had from the job that was lost. We expanded support for families who are experiencing food hardship. We expanded SNAP and food stamp benefits. So I would say that most policy scholars think that the US had a healthy, quick response that helped a lot of families, but it was all temporary. And so, I mean, we can see in the data in the US that the child poverty rate decreased dramatically, again, by definition, because of all the money that the government was sending out. I mean, just mechanically, we cut the child poverty rate like in half, but that was all temporary. And now those rates are back where they were. And if you've been following the Biden Build Back Better plan, you will know that it's stalled out in Congress, that a lot of people working in my area, policy scholars concerned with families and children, were hoping that those temporary mitigations would become permanent, that we would have a sort of permanent child benefit for low-income families, to raise those families out of poverty. And that was on the table in this Build Back Better plan, along with many other policies that would have greatly benefited low-income families whose, life challenges were so much revealed during COVID. But that's all completely in limbo at this point. Again, if you just are following what's happening. So that's been very discouraging.
We have time for a couple more questions here. We have one from the Philippines, from an audience member who's interested in knowing the impact on the pandemic on social interactions of low-income families as it manifests on the development of the effects of young children, like speech development of children and their social skills and their stress levels and their ability to manage those stress levels. Would you relate your study to this, or could you relate your study or your experience or other research to that question?
Yeah, I mean, again, we don't have the kind of child development outcomes. In fact, I believe that you can make a plug for the upcoming webinar, which I'm participating in a couple of weeks, is actually going to be focusing on exactly this topic, which is what has been the impact of COVID on family dynamics and children's learning. I think in the broad sense, I can make a link, however, which is just fits into a huge broad area of research that just says that individuals' subjective states matter and how parents and people feel and the psychological stresses and strains that they perceive are meaningful vis-a-vis the other ways that they deploy their attention and make decisions and engage in behaviors. And since we're talking about parents who live with young children, I think it would not be hard to imagine a second set of and third and fourth set of questions that just built out this question, which would just sort of substitute, well, does this feeling of subjective scarcity on, financial or other dimensions shape not only parents' attention to information, but maybe their attention to their kid or their attention to other things in the home environment that facilitate children's development? I don't think it's a leap to say that that's a question worth exploring.
And that ties to my final question. which we always like to try to end on a positive note if we can. And that being, were there any real positive findings from this study that you uncovered? And one that's on my mind is COVID actually forced us all to spend more time together as families. So there was really maybe an overabundance of, not a scarcity of time where people could be together. Is that a positive? And are there any other positives? And I'll end on that question.
Sure. I mean, I can tell you about a separate paper that we wrote, which found something quite along those lines, which I alluded to the fact that for some families in the US, that the stimulus and support, which was temporary, that they got from the government was actually something like a financial windfall for them, in the sense that they gained back the time that they weren't working. And for many low-income families, the jobs at which they're working are not great. They are stressful jobs in not great environments many times. So if you lose that job, you by definition get all that time. And if you have this government substitute for your earnings, it's kind of like paid parental leave, which we don't have here. But this was a sort of temporary experience for some low-income families. In a different paper, we were able to identify those families in our data. Who is the family who lost jobs but not income? Right? They fit this description. And in fact, we find that those families report much more positive parent-child interactions and well-being. And so that to us, led us to think about, wow, if we could have real paid parental leave where parents were able to spend time at home with their kids and not suffer economically as a consequence, that really can produce some very positive interactions in the home environment.
Well, that's a great way to end the program today. And I want to thank you, Professor Kalil, for sharing your knowledge on this really important topic. And thanks for plugging your upcoming program. I'm going to plug it some more here as we close out the session today. I'm certain that everybody on this program has a deeper understanding of how COVID has impacted families, especially low-income families with less educated parents. I'd like to remind everyone of our alumni, especially, and interested community members, it's annual Giving Day at the University of Chicago. If you'd like to support the kind of research that Professor Kalil is doing, please send us an email at hk@uchicago.edu, or we can put you in touch with the right department or Professor Kalil herself if you're interested. And you can also visit the website givingday.uchicago.edu. We have a brief poll on today's program for the audience on Zoom. If you're watching live on Facebook or YouTube, you can leave your answers in the comments below. And while you complete the survey, let me just tell you a little bit more about the upcoming programs. Next Tuesday, on April 12th at 8:30 p.m., our faculty director, Kenneth Pomerantz, will join us again for a program he'll moderate, which includes 3 faculty from the University of Chicago and an alumnus to discuss how digital tools are transforming the study of East Asian studies and the humanities and social sciences. That's a really interesting program. I hope you can join. Also, as Professor Kalil mentioned, she'll return on April 21st at 10 a.m., again, another morning program, to moderate a panel of experts and discuss COVID's disruptions in early childhood development, family, and social relationships. So if we didn't get to your question today, come back on April 12th at 10 a.m. and we'll try to address those questions then. Make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, and our UN Campus website for more information about our upcoming programs. It's a wonderful day here in Hong Kong, beautiful, gorgeous weather. I hope you all have a safe and productive rest of your week. Thank you so much.